healing and about herbs and about, ancient practice. And I think that it probably lent itself quite highly to that. And I like thinking about that because I think it really lends itself to, where we are now. There's a long tradition of naturopathic plants in medicine. It's the evolution of the field of medicine. It's the evolution of the field of, nutrition and anything. And so we all kind of rely heavily on plants in so many ways. But I think it's important as we're moving into this next kind of realm when you're talking about strict regulations and grow houses and extracting and different, ways in which people are utilizing this from just an individual and treating somebody that way to also just a very huge, large systemic shifts. So, in some ways it's like, this is so new. We're going, wow, this just happened. But in some ways this has been going on for a very, very, very long time in a variety of different ways and forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of curious for you, is there specific training, in the work that you do that people kind of engage in? Is there a certificate? I mean, is there...
Right. Well,
what is that? Yeah.
We're finding that, well, what I know is that many of our major, pretty reputable universities and colleges now have cannabis training programs.
Oh, wow.
Whether it be cannabis marketing or how to set up your own cannabis business. And there hasn't been a whole lot around medical cannabis just because we are still waiting for a lot of information. But I think that people that have been in this for a long time and who have been the pioneers and the activists who have a lot of experience working with people that really just, they either decided to because they believe in it, or at that point they had no choice. Like they really, it was this or something, or not looking at what the issues that they're going through at all. So, I think that there has been substantial data gathered, but obviously it wasn't in like it's not a research-based study.
Right.
And so we're going off of what we know that is based on what people are reporting, but there are a few schools popping up that are talking about not necessarily the therapeutic ways to use cannabis, but just research and facts and things that people have been finding.
Right.
And I think some of the time practitioners like me will look to places like Colorado, where they have a few more years on us around this topic.
Right.
And they do have schools and holistic academies that provide this type of information. I haven't personally taken them yet because right now I'm working with people that are local and really, have been in it for a long time, and there's just so much to learn. So, we'll see how it all evolves.
I have another question, and I have a feeling you probably experience this as well, but I often get a lot of questions from patients, or even, patients saying to doctors, or doctors coming to me and saying, what do I say here? When patients are saying, we with this kind of in this new, very, high-end world of cannabis, I should say, or accessible, making recommendations. When do I use a sativa? When do I use an indica? When do I use a hybrid? It's not something I know a lot about as a layman, sure. But, what do you say to patients? What do you say to providers who ask you those questions? Who do you refer them to?
Yeah, and that's a common question. We used to think that indica was also, to help people remember, we'd say in the couch. So that, that it's like a downer, it helps you relax. And
the classic.
Right. But actually, it's not really the case because some people might take indicas and they'll feel really uplifted and energetic. And some people will experience like, the very sort of relaxed, wanting to go to sleep type of effect with sativas. And the name indica and sativa refers to the plant itself and where where it grows geographically. One is longer and grows higher, and one is shorter and rounder. And so, most of our strains now are hybrids. It's very difficult to find like a pure sativa and a pure indica. And I always compare it with apples. In order to have one pure type of apple, you have to make it, you have to work hard at it and keep that from cross-pollinating and evolving, because that's just how life works and how nature works. And that's how I compare it to the strains now. And so
that's a really great example.
Right, are hybrids. They might have sativa-like qualities because we need a way to describe them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that will be how it affects you. And so we have this, I think the States use this approach too, called start low, go slow.
Right.
And if you're new to it, microdosing is a really great way to start and get an idea.
What is microdosing? Like, what do you say to patients when or anybody? Because I'm hearing that a lot as well.
Right. Microdosing is essentially a very, very low dose. And some people will try to put a number on it. So, in some instances, they'll say 1 to 2 milligrams or less. And then in some instances, it'll be less than 5 milligrams. But essentially, when we talk about microdosing, it's not about necessarily the feeling of euphoria, but it's just enough to help you feel what you need to feel, whether it be relaxed, or maybe it's a relaxation in the mind or in the body, or maybe it'll help pain. But it's just enough to get you there, but it's not necessarily enough to like make you feel like there's a very heavy psychoactive effect on you. And this is a great way for beginners, just to learn what where their threshold is.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's just, we're using so much of the same terminology that we talk about when people are trialing pain medication, right. And thinking about, what is that threshold or pain management. So it's kind of amazing to think about using, this medical language and the way that we talk about, medication, traditional medication in the medical setting, and applying it to how we're talking about cannabis use.
Right. Have you encountered people that have used synthetic cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the logistics, I would say, in that case, but I've worked in a lot of different oncology centers, and typically, and maybe this is changing in the last few months with our recreational, our physicians would say, yeah, I can write you a prescription. It's up to you and the dispensary to figure out what the best methodology is and the best way. So most of the physicians I've worked for aren't, they're giving of general prescriptions, but not recommendations of pills versus, something else. I mean, I think they would say probably for lung cancer patients, it's not a good idea to smoke. But, I think mostly here, the system has relied heavily on people in these medical dispensaries to make those recommendations on behalf of the physician, which has been complicated. Again, which is, coming back to why regulation and having more education for the doctors, I think, is essential. And they want it because the conversations are happening. 80% of the physicians in the U.S. it's happening in practice, but going, well, what do I do, and who's doing it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point, because I do experience this here as well, which is when patients get their medical cannabis authorization and the doctor's like, the obvious things like, you're probably better to consider maybe an oral in terms of like an edible, maybe an oil or capsule, but not smoking if you have respiratory issues and things like that. But then after that, they're on their own. And there's so much about cannabis and the way that you can work with it, depending on whatever ailment that you're experiencing. So, if you have a GI issue, it's probably better that you consider eating it so it gets into your digestive tract. And that doesn't mean eating anything you like. It means eating things that are also going to be helpful for your GI tract, like probiotics. And that can be worked into, let's say, we can make it fun. We can make it like a probiotic guacamole or hummus that has CBD or cannabis oil in it to help with inflammation. So there's so many, it's so versatile. But the information, like how you get that information can sometimes be tricky.
Right. And I think for a lot of patients, it's really intimidating to go in somewhere or to have that, yet another provider, a cannabis provider, and say, here's what I'm dealing with. I was recently diagnosed with a cancer diagnosis or a cardiovascular issue or whatever it is. And, here's what I'm dealing with. What would you recommend? It's I think can be really challenging and hard on the patient. And again, the more I think we're able to encourage those conversations and collaborate between these different disciplines, the better it will be. Like, wouldn't it be great if whatever dispensary then sent a little note to the referring provider saying, this is what I came up with?
Right. Wow. Yeah. I also remind people that, there are other alternatives to cannabis also.
Absolutely.
If you have inflammation, there's turmeric that you can eat. And if you, have, pain or respiratory issues, you can use magnesium to help open up your bronchial or respiratory system. So, there are other plants out there that have just as much therapeutic properties. So.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of, inaccurate information out there. I think that's a big part also is like, well, I heard this and I heard that. And, and I think that's with anything, actually, people with psychotropic medication for depression or anxiety, are saying, well, I heard I may have to be on this forever. Or I heard if I exercise, it's just as effective as, taking an SSRI for treating depression. And you kind of hear these stories or buzzwords or things like that. And it really, involves really communicating with the patient, talking them, assessing them, really figuring out what these things look like and coming up with a really effective treatment plan. Because we know that not just one thing works. We know that sometimes we do need to rely on an SSRI to do something different that not other medications can do, and it is a balance, but it definitely involves communicating with patients.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I think we're almost out of time. Is there something that anything else you want to talk about?
I think this has just been so great to connect and hear more about what's going on in Canada and your practice and the patients that you're seeing. It's been so great to, hopefully share a little bit about oncology care and psycho-oncology care. But what I think is just amazing is how much we're able to talk about this. So the fact that there's a podcast to really highlight some of these issues is tremendous.
Right. And one of the reasons why I was really wanting to talk to you specifically about this is, working with people and patients, knowing that, cannabis, it can be a really helpful tool, one of the many tools in health and wellness. But it's not always the answer, and definitely you should proceed with some caution and make sure that there's tons of good studies out there now that we can refer to. And if you are working with a healthcare professional, I'm sure that they would be able